Most parents ask the same question about tantrums. When do they stop? But that question actually leads to the wrong answer because tantrums don't disappear on a birthday. What actually changes between ages 1 and 5 is something happening inside the brain. The regulatory system matures, but it doesn't mature linearly. And this is where many parents get confused. By the time your child is 4 or 5, they feel so grown up. They're verbal, they're funny, they can reason, they can explain their feelings. My daughter has been extremely verbal from a young age. As she grew, she was able to communicate feelings, negotiate, recite stories, even remember events from months ago. And then she'd suddenly collapse into a puddle on the floor because her cheese had a hole in it. When a meltdown happens, whether it's in a rather mature 3-year-old or even a 5-year-old, it can feel shocking. You think, how is this still happening? But intelligence is not regulation. Language is not regulation. Understanding a rule is not the same as having the neurological ability to stay regulated when emotions spike. So to answer the question, when do tantrums stop? We need to walk through what exactly is happening in the brain from about age 1 to age 5. Because what changes during these years is not whether the children have big emotions. What changes is the relationship between emotional drive and regulatory capacity. So let's define what a tantrum actually is biologically. A tantrum is a temporary loss of top-down control during a spike in emotional arousal. When something frustrating or overwhelming happens, the limbic system, the emotional center of the brain, activates quickly. Stress hormones rise. The sympathetic nervous system ramps up. And the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for impulse control, flexible thinking, and emotional regulation, becomes less effective. This happens to adults too. Under enough stress, adults lose regulatory control. But children have a much less mature prefrontal cortex, so the threshold for losing that control is much lower. Developmental researchers studying early emotional regulation, including Ross Thompson, describe this process as the gradual development of the top-down control in the brain. So as parents, we need to train ourselves to remember, a tantrum is not primarily a moral failure. It's not primarily defiance, and it's not primarily a discipline. It's a nervous system event. And the balance between the emotional system and the regulatory system shifts dramatically between ages 1 and 5. So let's break it down year by year. Between about 1 and 2 years old, the brain is undergoing extremely rapid growth. Synapses are forming at an extraordinary rate. Motor development is exploding. Children can suddenly walk, climb, grab, explore. But the regulatory systems of the brain are still extremely immature. The prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for inhibition control, is barely functioning in a meaningful way. Working memory is minimal. Impulse control is almost non-existent. So what you have at this age is a child with powerful desires and almost no neurological braking system. The go system, online. The wait system, not so much. At this stage, children are very capable of wanting things intensely. They are capable of exploring, experimenting, and learning cause and effect. But they are not capable of holding rules in mind. They are not capable of delaying gratification. They're not capable of intentionally calming themselves down. And they are not capable of understanding that a feeling will pass. So what does this look like in everyday life? You probably know. It looks like throwing their body on the floor when something is taken away. It looks like screaming when they are physically prevented from doing something dangerous. It looks like immediate escalation when frustration hits. And although it may seem like it, it's not calculated behavior. It's frustration meeting an immature regulatory system. At this age, regulation is almost entirely external. This means that children borrow regulation from us, from the adults around them. That means your nervous system is doing a lot of the work through reducing stimulation, containing the situation, using simple language, keeping routines predictable, and helping them return to baseline. And one last thing, which may be the hardest thing, is keeping calm yourself. A 1 to 2-year-old cannot regulate themselves yet. They're learning what regulation feels like through repeated co-regulation. Neuroscientist Greer Kuchenbaum describes this process almost like building a foundation layer by layer. Thousands of interactions, a parent helping a child settle, helping them recover from frustration, helping them return to calm. Over time, those repeated experiences help shape the regulatory circuits in the brain. So children are not just being calmed down in those moments, they're learning what regulation feels like. I've often thought about it this way in our home, like laying foundation brick by brick through thousands of small interactions. But that process takes years. In the foundation, though, it lasts a lifetime, which is why what you do in those early years matters more than it might feel like in the moment. And this is where things get really interesting. Around 2 or 3 years old, something important changes. Cognition expands dramatically, language is exploding, symbolic thinking is developing. Memory is improving. Children can now remember past events and anticipate future ones. And this increased awareness changes the emotional landscape. Suddenly, a child can think about what should happen. They can remember promises. They can imagine outcomes. They can compare fairness. But the regulatory system still hasn't caught up. The prefrontal cortex, still developing. Inhibitory control, still inconsistent. So now you have a child who can think much further ahead, but still can't regulate the emotional consequence of that thinking. And this is one reason tantrums often peak around age 2 to 3. Children become aware of more frustrations than they can manage. You'll often hear things like, "You said yesterday," or they might melt down over things that seem abstract to adults. Maybe a different colored cup, maybe a change in plans, something feeling unfair, a hole in their cheese. From outside, it can look intentional. It can even look manipulative. But neurologically, the child's awareness has expanded faster than their regulation. They understand the disappointment, but they just can't manage it yet. And this is the stage that confuses parents the most. By the time children reach about 4 years old, many parents feel like they're living with a very mature person. Working memory is improving, language is strong, children can reflect on behavior, they can apologize, they can negotiate, they can explain their feelings. Some preschoolers, like my daughter, are even beginning to read at this age. And yet meltdowns still happen. During my daughter's 4th year, I've had many conversations with my husband, and honestly with myself, reminding both of us that she's only 4. The prefrontal cortex is becoming more active. Connections between the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system are strengthening, but those connections are still fragile, and the regulation at this age is still highly state-dependent. That means it works well when the child is calm and rested, but breaks down under stress, under fatigue, under overstimulation, when there's an unexpected disappointment, in transitions. Any of these things can push the nervous system into a higher arousal state, where the ability to regulate drops quickly. Because knowing something is not the same thing as regulating. Even very bright children still experience moments when their nervous system can't downshift on its own. Around age 5, regulatory capacity continues to strengthen. Impulse control improves. Working memory becomes more stable. And children are better able to pause before reacting. They have stronger emotional vocabulary. They have more insight into their own feelings. And this is when many parents begin to notice that the tantrums themselves start to change. They tend to be less frequent, shorter. Recovery becomes faster. A child might still lose control, but they can often come back from it more quickly. But even at 5 years old, the regulatory system is still developing. Stress tolerance is still limited. Sleep loss still affects behavior. And emotional intensity, especially around social situations, can still overwhelm the system. So tantrums don't suddenly disappear. What changes is the balance between emotional drive and regulatory control. The regulatory system is becoming stronger, but it's still under construction. One thing many parents notice is that tantrums don't steadily decrease. They tend to come in waves, and that's because development doesn't happen smoothly. The brain develops in bursts. Language expands, cognitive awareness expands, social awareness expands. Each of these changes increase what a child can perceive. And when perception expands faster than regulation, frustration expands too. A child suddenly notices more unfairness, more expectations, more comparisons, more disappointments. But the regulatory system takes time to catch up. So tantrums often increase during periods when awareness is expanding faster than regulatory capacity. What looks like regression is often simply the brain adjusting to a new developmental stage. One thing that's easy to miss is that regulation isn't just psychological, it's physiological. A well-rested child who ate lunch is neurologically a different child than one who didn't. Sleep deprivation reduces the efficiency of the prefrontal cortex, and at the same time, it decreases reactivity in emotional centers of the brain. That combination lowers the frustration tolerance. Metabolic stability matters too. When blood sugar drops quickly, regulatory capacity drops with it. In environments with high stimulation, fast transitions, loud environments, constant novelty, those can raise the baseline arousal state. When baseline arousal is high, it takes much less stress to push the system into meltdown. This isn't personality, it's physiology. So let's return to the question, when do tantrums stop? Developmental research consistently shows that tantrums tend to peak around ages 2 to 3 and gradually decline as regulatory capacity improves through the preschool years. By school age, frequent daily tantrums are uncommon in typically developing children, but emotional dysregulation does not vanish. What changes is frequency, duration, recovery, and the degree of internal regulation. Tantrums are not primarily discipline failures. They are nervous system events happening in a brain that is still learning how to regulate. The real developmental trajectory isn't toward perfect emotional control. It's toward increasing capacity to recover. So instead of asking, when will tantrums stop? A more useful question might be, how can I support my child's capacity to regulate at each stage of development? And equally important, what helps their nervous system remain closer to baseline? Because one of the most powerful ways to reduce tantrums isn't reacting better in the moment. It's lowering the overall stress load on the nervous system. Predictable routines, smooth transitions, adequate sleep, environmental structure. In the next video, I'm actually going to walk through the systems we built in our home that dramatically reduce tantrums and why those systems work biologically. Subscribe if you don't want to miss it.